Most people don't lose their integrity all at once. They lose it at threshold, in an argument, in a moment of urgency, in a room where everyone else is saying yes. Pressure doesn't destroy character, it reveals what governs it. I'm Kay McLeod, and this is Integrity Under Pressure, a podcast about self governance, consequence literacy, and how to protect your integrity when willpower isn't enough. Because integrity isn't a personality trait, it's a governance skill. Most integrity failures are not loud. They don't arrive with shouting. They don't begin with betrayal. They begin quietly with something you don't say. A moment you let slide. A small discomfort you decide isn't worth addressing. And nothing dramatic happens. Life continues. The relationship continues. The team continues. The band continues. But something has already begun accumulating. Pressure. Not external pressure, internal pressure. And internal pressure has a very interesting property. It compounds slowly, silently, until the day it doesn't stay silent anymore. Because the cost of unspoken tension is rarely paid in the moment, it's paid later, usually all at once. And when it arrives, people think the explosion is the problem. But the explosion is rarely the problem, it's the bill. Years ago, I was in a cover band, and honestly, at first it was fantastic. We were playing great venues, the crowds were fun. Music is one of the few places where you can watch a room of strangers become a community for 3 hours. People who walked in as accountants, as nurses, and construction workers suddenly become a choir. Everyone singing the same lyrics. It's actually a beautiful social experiment. Also, one of the few places where people who normally avoid eye contact will suddenly scream Metallica lyrics together like lifelong friends, which tells you something interesting about human psychology. Apparently, the fastest way to create unity is either a shared crisis or an 80s rock anthem, preferably both. But eventually, something shifted. One member of the band and I began experiencing friction. Not huge arguments, not dramatic conflicts, just small moments, comments, looks, tone, decisions made without discussion. Nothing that would sound serious if you described it casually. But internally, I noticed something happening. I wasn't saying anything. Every time something bothered me, I decided it wasn't worth it. So I told myself, it's not a big deal, let it go, keep the peace, which sounds mature. It even sounds emotionally intelligent. But sometimes keeping the peace is actually just postponing the conflict. And postponing conflict does not eliminate it, it stores it, like emotional compound interest. And compound interest works beautifully for retirement accounts. It works terribly for resentment because resentment doesn't sit quietly, it accumulates. One small moment, then another, each one adding a little more pressure. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as suppression rebound. When emotional responses are repeatedly suppressed rather than processed, they often return later with greater intensity, which means silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is pressure, and pressure eventually looks for a release valve. Mine arrived one night during a gig. It wasn't a catastrophic situation, just another small moment, another comment, another look, another tone, but internally something snapped. All the conversations I had been having in my own head suddenly came out. Not not calmly, not constructively, explosively. Years of silent internal dialogue. delivered in one very loud moment. And if you've ever experienced something like that, you know the strange thing about it. To everyone else in the room, the explosion appears sudden, unexpected, disproportionate. From their perspective, it looks like this: everything was fine, then suddenly you lost control. Which means the story people see is very different from the story you experienced. Inside your head, there were months of conversation, but nobody else heard those conversations. They only saw the explosion, which means the narrative becomes simple. You're the problem. You're the unstable one. You're the one who caused the chaos. And in my case, the next day I was planning to quit the band. I had already decided, but I never got the chance. They fired me first. And now the story was even cleaner. I was the bad one, the explosive one, the problem. And what made that moment particularly painful was something many people recognized. Internally, I believed I had been the one tolerating disrespect, but externally, I had become the person who destroyed the peace. It felt like boomerang. The energy I had been suppressing for months came back and hit me directly in the face. Anger, fear, shame. And the strange thing about shame is that it rarely argues with the story, even when the story is incomplete. The next day, I wrote what I call a repair email, acknowledging the explosion, taking responsibility for my behavior, trying to explain what I'd been building. But here is something difficult about repair. Repair can correct behavior, it cannot erase perception. Once a narrative forms in a group, it is remarkably sticky. Social psychologists call this fundamental attribution error. Humans tend to attribute other people's behavior to their character rather than their circumstances. So if someone explodes, we assume they are explosive. We rarely investigate the pressure that preceded it, which means by the time the repair email was sent, the story was already decided. And in many ways, the band story itself wasn't the real lesson. The real lesson was something much more uncomfortable. The explosion had not actually happened that night, it had happened months earlier. The moment I stopped speaking, the moment I began running silent arguments inside my own head instead of having real conversations. That was the real turning point because unspoken tension doesn't disappear, it reorganizes. And usually it reorganizes inside the ego, which is an extremely creative storyteller. The ego builds narratives. They're disrespecting you. You're the only one being reasonable. You've tolerated enough. And because these conversations happen privately, nobody else has the opportunity to challenge them. The story grows unchecked until the moment it erupts. And when it erupts, everyone else sees only the final scene, not the chapters leading up to it. There's an old parable about a boiling point. If you place a lid on a pot of boiling water, the steam does not disappear. It builds pressure, and eventually that lid lifts, usually dramatically. Relationships work in a similar way. Pressure requires ventilation, which means governance is not only about managing reactions, it's about managing pressure before reaction becomes inevitable. This is where discernment becomes important. Discernment is not simply noticing what other people are doing, it is noticing what is happening inside you in response. When tension first appears, when resentment first appears, when something feels slightly off, those are the moments where governance has the greatest leverage, not later. Not during explosion, but early, when the pressure is still small, which leads to a doctrine that has become very important in my life. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is pressure. And pressure eventually collects interest because the cause of unspoken tension is rarely visible immediately. It shows up later in explosions, in broken trusts, in relationships that suddenly end, in teams that fracture, in decisions that feel irrational to everyone except the person who made them, the person who experienced the internal story. And here's the subtle danger. People often believe the problem is the explosion, but the explosion is only the visible moment. The real cause was accumulating long before anyone noticed. And once you begin seeing this pattern, you notice it everywhere. In workplaces where employees quietly tolerate decisions they disagree with, in friendships where small resentments are never addressed, in marriages where conversations become careful and polite rather than honest. Externally, anything looks calm, but internally, pressure is building. Eventually, it emerges. And what it does, people say things like, where did that come from? Where did that come from? But it didn't come from nowhere. It came from the cost nobody was tracking, the cost of not speaking earlier, the cost of choosing temporary comfort over early clarity. Now, this doesn't mean every tension must become confrontation. Discernment matters. But governance requires something many people avoid: timely honesty, not explosive honesty, early honesty, the kind that addresses pressure before it becomes a crisis, which is uncomfortable, but far less destructive than waiting until the ego decides to release the pressure all at once. Because when the ego releases pressure, it rarely does so elegantly. It does so theatrically, preferably in public, which is not the moment most people hope to discover their self governance skills. So, if there is a lesson in that band story, it is not about conflict, it's about timing. Integrity is not only about what you say, it's about when you say it. Early truth often prevents late chaos, and that is something many people learn the expensive way. I certainly did, which leads to a question that might be worth sitting with for a moment. Where in your life are you currently absorbing pressure instead of addressing it? Where are you telling yourself something is not a big deal while quietly collecting evidence that it actually is? And if that pressure continues accumulating, what might the eventual bill look like? Because the most expensive conflicts in life are rarely the loudest ones. They're the ones that built quietly until the cost could no longer remain unseen. And the real question is this: will you address the pressure early or wait until the cost becomes visible to everyone? If this episode did anything, let it be this. You saw the pattern. Pressure is not the problem. The question is whether you govern yourself inside it. Hold that and decide what you're no longer willing to do on autopilot. Because integrity isn't a personality trait, it's a governance skill. I'll see you on the next episode.